Fort Moore sprawled across the Georgia landscape like a small city dedicated to creating America's most elite soldiers. Marcus arrived with 37 other candidates, each carrying their own story of transformation and determination. The Special Operations Training Course would separate those who dreamed of excellence from those who could achieve it. Instructor Sergeant First Class Chun examined the group with the clinical assessment of someone who had seen hundreds of hopeful candidates over the years. His opening speech was delivered in the flat, matter-of-fact tone of absolute authority. "Gentlemen, look around you. Statistical probability suggests that fewer than half of you will complete this course. Of those who do, perhaps 6 or 7 will qualify for advanced sniper training. Of those, maybe 3 will actually graduate as certified snipers. The question isn't whether you think you can do it. The question is whether you can do it when everything inside you is screaming to quit." Marcus felt the familiar flutter of nerves in his stomach, but this time he didn't reach for a joke to deflect the tension. Instead, he focused on the instructor's words, filing away every detail about what would be expected of him in the weeks ahead. The first phase focused on advanced marksmanship and fieldcraft. Marcus discovered that his natural hand-eye coordination, honed through years of video games and casual sports, translated remarkably well to precision shooting. But raw talent meant nothing without the mental discipline to apply it consistently under stress. "Rodriguez, you're thinking too much," called out Master Sergeant Williams during a particularly challenging shooting exercise. "Your brain is your worst enemy out here. Stop trying to calculate every variable and trust your training." The advice seemed counterintuitive to Marcus, who had always relied on overthinking and analysis to navigate social situations. But as he learned to quiet his internal commentary and focus purely on breathing, sight alignment, and trigger control, his scores improved dramatically. Days blended into weeks as the training intensified. Physical demands pushed every candidate to their breaking point, but the psychological pressure was even more relentless. Marcus watched strong men wash out not because they lacked skill, but because they couldn't handle the isolation and mental strain that came with sniper operations. During week 6, Marcus faced his greatest challenge yet. The exercise required him to remain motionless in a concealed position for 8 hours while maintaining constant surveillance on a target area. Any movement, any lapse in attention, would result in automatic failure. As the hours crawled by, Marcus's mind wandered to his old life. He thought about Friday night parties where his biggest concern was whether his latest joke would land well with the crowd. The contrast between that version of himself and the soldier lying perfectly still in the Georgia heat was almost surreal. A squirrel landed on his back during hour 5, using him as a convenient resting spot. Marcus's first instinct was to smile at the absurdity of the situation, but he caught himself and remained absolutely motionless. The squirrel stayed for 20 minutes before moving on, apparently satisfied that Marcus posed no threat to the forest ecosystem. When the exercise ended, Sergeant Chun approached Marcus with something that might have been approval in his usually stoic expression. "Rodriguez, that was textbook fieldcraft. You didn't move a muscle for 8 hours, even when that squirrel decided to make you his personal furniture. That kind of self-control can't be taught. Either you have it or you don't." Marcus felt a surge of pride that was different from any applause he'd ever received. This wasn't about entertaining an audience. It was about mastering himself completely in service of something larger than personal gratification. The advanced phases of training brought new challenges that tested every aspect of Marcus's developing skills. Navigation exercises required him to move undetected through hostile territory. Communication drills demanded he relay critical information with absolute precision while under simulated combat stress. But it was the psychological preparation that proved most demanding. Sniper operations often required soldiers to spend days or weeks in isolation, maintaining mission focus without the support and camaraderie that sustained other military roles. Marcus had to confront every doubt, every fear, every weakness in his character without the social buffers he'd always used to avoid uncomfortable truths about himself. "Tell me why you're here, Rodriguez," said Captain Morrison during one of the mandatory psychological evaluations. "Not the official answer you put in your application. The real reason." Marcus had expected this question, but found himself struggling to articulate the complex mix of motivations that had brought him to this point. The grocery store incident seemed too simple, his desire to prove himself too superficial. "Sir, I spent years being someone people turned to when they wanted to feel better, but never when they needed to feel safe. I want to be the person they turn to when safety actually matters." The captain made notes without changing expression. "That's a heavy responsibility. Are you prepared for what it means to hold someone else's life in your hands? To make decisions that determine whether people go home to their families?" The weight of the question settled on Marcus's shoulders like physical pressure. He thought about his cartoon tattoo, about the innocent belief that making people laugh was the highest service he could offer humanity. The man he was becoming understood that sometimes protection required more than humor. "I think I'm beginning to understand what it means, sir. And I think I'm ready to find out what I'm capable of." Week 12 brought the final selection process. Only 14 candidates remained from the original 37, and each would undergo a series of tests designed to identify those with the rare combination of technical skill, mental toughness, and emotional stability required for sniper operations. The culminating exercise placed Marcus alone in the field for 72 hours with minimal supplies and a series of complex mission objectives. He had to navigate to specific coordinates, conduct surveillance on multiple targets, and transmit detailed intelligence reports while avoiding detection by hunter-killer teams actively searching for him. On the second night, exhausted and running low on water, Marcus found himself questioning everything about his journey. His muscles ached, his mind felt foggy from fatigue, and the comfortable bed back home seemed like paradise compared to his current position wedged between rocks in a natural hide site. The cartoon character on his arm was visible in the faint moonlight, still grinning its cheerful grin. For a moment, Marcus felt a powerful urge to give up, to return to the simple world where making people smile was enough. But as he stared at the tattoo, he realized it no longer represented failure or inadequacy. Instead, it had become a reminder of how much he'd grown, how far he'd traveled from the person who thought entertainment was the only way to serve others. He completed the exercise successfully, transmitting his final intelligence report exactly on schedule despite being discovered by the hunter-killer team only hours before the deadline. The close call had required him to use every skill he'd learned about concealment, evasion, and tactical movement. Graduation day arrived with the formal precision that marked every significant military milestone. 13 candidates stood at attention as their names were called and their new assignments announced. Marcus felt his heart rate increase as Captain Morrison approached with his orders. "Sergeant Rodriguez, you will report to the United States Army Sniper Course at Fort Benning. Upon successful completion, you'll be assigned to 1st Battalion, 75th Ranger Regiment. Congratulations, soldier." The packet in Marcus's hands contained more than just orders. It contained the final piece of his transformation from class clown to elite soldier. The sniper course at Fort Benning was the ultimate test, a program so demanding that even seasoned special operations soldiers struggled to complete it. His parents attended the graduation ceremony, looking proud but slightly stunned by the magnitude of their son's achievement. As they drove to dinner afterward, Marcus caught his father studying him in the rearview mirror. "Son, I have to admit something. When you first told us you were enlisting, I thought it was just another phase, another way of avoiding responsibility. I was wrong. What you've accomplished here, what you're about to take on next, I'm not sure I could have done it at your age." Marcus felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with external validation. The approval meant something because it was earned through demonstrable achievement rather than performed charm. He had become someone whose capabilities commanded respect rather than someone whose personality demanded attention. The final weeks at Fort Moore flew by in a blur of administrative processing and advanced preparation for sniper school. Marcus studied ballistics charts and weather patterns with the intensity he'd once devoted to comedy timing. Every moment of free time was spent honing his skills, preparing for the ultimate test of everything he'd learned about himself. On his last night before reporting to Fort Benning, Marcus called his grandfather again. The old man listened quietly as Marcus described his training and his upcoming assignment. "Grandson, when I served in Vietnam, I knew soldiers like the one you're becoming. They weren't the loudest or the most obvious heroes. They were the quiet professionals who did the hardest jobs without needing recognition. They saved lives by taking their responsibilities seriously. You've chosen a difficult path, but it's an honorable one. The conversation reminded Marcus of something fundamental that had been growing in his understanding throughout his training. The transition from making people laugh to protecting their lives wasn't really about changing who he was. It was about finding the deepest expression of his desire to serve others. As he prepared for bed that final night, Marcus looked at his reflection in the small mirror above his sink. The face looking back at him was leaner, more focused, marked by months of demanding training and personal growth. The cartoon character tattoo on his arm was barely visible beneath his uniform, but it no longer felt like a contradiction to his military identity. Tomorrow he would begin sniper school, the final phase of a journey that had started with a grocery store incident and a moment of clarity about what really mattered in life. The path ahead would be more challenging than anything he'd yet faced, but Marcus Rodriguez was no longer the young man who had chosen comfort over challenge. He was someone who had learned that the highest form of service wasn't making people laugh when times were easy, but standing watch when times were dangerous. The transformation was complete not because he'd stopped being the person who could bring joy to others, but because he'd become someone capable of ensuring they would live to experience that joy safely. The bus to Fort Benning left at dawn, carrying 37 young men and women toward their new lives. Marcus pressed his face against the window, watching his hometown disappear behind them. The other recruits chatted nervously or slept, but Marcus found himself studying their faces, wondering who would make it through and who would wash out. Basic training hit him like a physical blow. Staff Sergeant Morrison, a compact man with eyes like flint, seemed to take personal pleasure in breaking down everything Marcus thought he knew about himself. The first week was a nightmare of failed push-ups, missed targets, and endless verbal corrections that felt designed to strip away every comfortable layer of his old identity. Rodriguez. Morrison's voice cut through the morning air like a blade. You think this is funny? You think my army is some kind of joke? Marcus had made the mistake of smiling during a particularly brutal set of exercises, not because he found anything amusing, but because smiling was his automatic response to stress. Old habits died hard, apparently. No, Staff Sergeant, Marcus replied, his voice steadier than he felt. Then, why are you grinning like an idiot? You think those enemy fighters overseas are going to laugh along with your little comedy routine? The words stung because they touched on Marcus's deepest fear about himself. Was he really just a joke? Someone who couldn't be serious when it mattered? He spent that night doing extra push-ups until his arms shook, not because he'd been ordered to, but because he needed to prove something to himself. Gradually, something unexpected began happening. The same quick wit that had made him popular in school started serving him in different ways. He learned to read people's moods, to know when a struggling bunkmate needed encouragement or when someone was about to crack under pressure. His natural ability to defuse tension became valuable in a group of stressed young men learning to function as a unit. You know what your problem is, Rodriguez? Asked Private Johnson one evening as they cleaned their equipment. Johnson was a serious kid from Alabama who rarely spoke unless necessary. You're smart, but you act dumb. You see everything, but you pretend you don't. Why do you do that? The question caught Marcus off guard because no one had ever called him smart before. Funny, yes. Clever, sometimes. But never smart. He spent the night thinking about Johnson's words, realizing that maybe his habit of playing the fool had been hiding abilities he'd never explored. Week by week, Marcus found himself changing in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. His marksmanship scores improved dramatically once he stopped trying to entertain his fellow shooters and focused purely on the target. His physical fitness tests went from barely passing to consistently high scores. Most importantly, he began to understand the difference between being liked and being respected. The real test came during the final field exercise, a grueling 4-day simulation that would determine who graduated and who got recycled for additional training. Marcus's squad was tasked with a night reconnaissance mission that required absolute precision and silence. One mistake could fail the entire team. As they moved through the dark forest, Marcus found himself naturally falling into the role of spotter, using his enhanced vision and pattern recognition skills to identify threats and obstacles before others saw them. The cartoon character tattooed on his arm was covered by his uniform sleeve, hidden like the joking persona he'd worn for so many years. "Contact, 2 o'clock," he whispered into his radio, spotting the outline of an opposing force soldier nearly invisible in the shadows. His voice was calm, professional, completely different from the kid who used to crack jokes during tense moments. The mission succeeded flawlessly. Afterward, Staff Sergeant Morrison pulled Marcus aside. "Rodriguez, I want to talk to you about advanced training opportunities. Your scores suggest you might be suited for specialized schools. Have you given any thought to what you want to do in the Army?" Marcus had been dreading this conversation because he knew what he wanted to pursue, but it seemed impossibly far from who he used to be. The idea had been growing in his mind for weeks, planted by his test scores and nurtured by his newfound ability to focus intensely on precise tasks. "I want to try for sniper school, Staff Sergeant." Morrison's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's serious business, son. Sniper training is some of the most demanding work the Army offers. It requires mental discipline most people don't possess. Physical demands are intense, but the psychological requirements are even tougher. Why do you think you want that?" Marcus had asked himself the same question many times. The honest answer was complex, involving his need to prove he could be more than comic relief, his discovery that he possessed capabilities he'd never explored, and something deeper about wanting to serve in a way that truly mattered. "Because I want to be the best at something that matters, Staff Sergeant. I spent years being good at making people laugh, but I want to be excellent at something that protects people instead." The conversation that followed would change the trajectory of Marcus's military career. Morrison explained the selection process, the failure rate, and the demands that would be placed on him if he was accepted. Fewer than 30% of candidates completed the program, and those who did underwent a fundamental transformation in how they saw themselves and their capabilities. "You'll need to submit an application packet," Morrison explained. "Physical fitness scores, marksmanship records, psychological evaluations, and recommendations from your chain of command. If you're selected, you'll report to Fort Moore for the Special Operations Training course. From there, if you make it, you'll move on to the actual sniper course. That's where most people wash out." Marcus spent his final weeks at Fort Benning preparing his application with the same intensity he'd once devoted to perfecting comedy routines. He researched everything about sniper training, studying the mental disciplines required and the standards he'd need to meet. The more he learned, the more certain he became that this was what he'd been searching for without knowing it. His graduation from basic training was a quiet affair. His parents came, looking proud but slightly bewildered by the transformation in their son. The young man they picked up bore little resemblance to the class clown who had left home months earlier. He stood straighter, spoke more carefully, and carried himself with a confidence they'd never seen before. "You look different," his mother said as they drove to dinner after the ceremony. "Older somehow. More serious." "I feel different," Marcus replied honestly. "I feel like I finally know what I'm supposed to be doing." His father, who had been skeptical about Marcus's military decision, studied his son's face in the rearview mirror. "Are you happy? I mean, really happy, not just putting on a show for us." The question hit deeper than his father probably intended. Marcus realized that for the first time in his adult life, he wasn't performing for anyone. The contentment he felt was genuine, earned through months of pushing beyond every limit he'd previously accepted for himself. "Yeah, Dad, I'm happy, and I'm just getting started." The notification came 3 weeks later while Marcus was completing his initial assignment at Fort Stewart. He'd been accepted for Special Operations Training course, with the possibility of advancing to sniper school upon successful completion. The letter felt heavier than paper in his hands, weighted with opportunity and responsibility. His first sergeant called him into the office that afternoon. "Rodriguez, this is a big opportunity. Special Operations Training has a high washout rate, and sniper school is even tougher. You sure you're ready for this?" Marcus thought about the grocery store incident that had started his journey, about the cartoon character on his arm that now seemed like a relic from another person's life. He thought about all the times he'd chosen the easy laugh over the difficult challenge, and how empty that had ultimately felt. "First Sergeant, I've been preparing for this my whole life without knowing it. I'm ready." The months of preparation that followed were unlike anything Marcus had ever experienced. Physical training became his morning ritual, marksmanship practice his afternoon meditation. He studied ballistics, weather patterns, and camouflage techniques with the same dedication he'd once applied to memorizing joke setups and punchlines. His bunkmates at Fort Stewart began calling him Scholar because of his constant studying, but the nickname didn't bother him the way classroom teasing once had. He was becoming someone who earned respect through competence rather than demanding attention through humor. The night before departing for Fort Moore, Marcus video called his grandfather for the first time since enlisting. The old man's face filled the screen, weathered and wise, carrying the quiet strength Marcus had always admired but never understood. "Grandson, your mother tells me you're pursuing specialized training." "Sniper school," she said. "Yes, sir. I know it sounds crazy, coming from me." His grandfather was quiet for a long moment, studying Marcus's face through the camera. When he finally spoke, his voice carried decades of hard-earned wisdom. "Son, the best soldiers aren't the ones who were born tough. They're the ones who chose to become tough when it mattered. You've made your choice. Now you have to see it through, no matter how hard it gets." That conversation stayed with Marcus as he boarded the transport to Fort Moore, leaving behind the last traces of his old life. The cartoon character tattooed on his arm was still there, still smiling its innocent smile, but Marcus no longer saw it as a definition of who he had to be. Instead, it had become a reminder of how far he'd traveled from the person who thought making others laugh was the highest calling he could achieve. Marcus Rodriguez had always been the class clown. Even at 22, fresh out of college with a degree he never thought he'd use, he carried that same mischievous grin that had gotten him both friends and trouble throughout his life. His childhood friends knew him as the guy who could make anyone laugh during the worst times, the one who turned every serious moment into something lighter. The tattoo parlor on 5th Street buzzed with the familiar sound of needles and quiet conversations. Marcus sat in the leather chair, trying not to wince as the artist worked on his forearm. The design was simple but meaningful to him. A cartoon character from his favorite childhood show, holding a peace sign with the words "Make Laugh, Not War" curved beneath it in playful script. "You sure about this, man?" asked Jake, the tattoo artist, pausing to wipe away excess ink. "Most people your age are getting skulls or eagles or something tough." Marcus chuckled, the sound echoing slightly in the small shop. "That's exactly why I want this. Everyone expects tough guys to be scary. I want to be the guy who makes people smile instead." The tattoo took 3 hours to complete. When Marcus finally looked at it in the mirror, he felt a surge of pride. This wasn't just ink on skin. It was a statement about who he was and who he wanted to be. He planned to show it off at his cousin's graduation party that weekend, knowing it would get laughs and probably some eye rolls from the older relatives. 2 weeks later, Marcus was stocking shelves at the local grocery store where he worked part-time while figuring out his next career move. The job wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills and gave him plenty of opportunities to brighten customers' days with jokes and friendly conversation. He was arranging cereal boxes when Mrs. Chun, a regular customer, approached with her usual serious expression. "Marcus, dear, have you thought about what you want to do with your life?" she asked, her voice carrying the weight of genuine concern that only elderly customers seemed capable of. Before he could answer with his usual deflecting joke, a commotion erupted near the front of the store. 3 men in dark clothing had entered, moving with purpose that immediately felt wrong. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he saw one of them pull something from his jacket. The peaceful Tuesday afternoon exploded into chaos as people began screaming and running. Marcus's first instinct was to crack a joke, to somehow defuse the tension with humor like he always did. But as he watched customers diving behind displays and heard the genuine terror in their voices, something shifted inside him. The weight of the moment pressed down on his shoulders, heavier than anything he'd ever felt. He found himself moving without thinking, positioning himself between the threat and a group of elderly customers who couldn't run fast enough. His hands shook, but his feet stayed planted. The cartoon character on his arm seemed to mock him now. What good was making people laugh when they needed someone to protect them? The situation lasted only 12 minutes before police arrived and resolved it peacefully. No shots were fired, no one was seriously hurt, but those 12 minutes changed something fundamental in Marcus. As he sat in the parking lot afterward, giving his statement to officers, he kept staring at his tattoo. The cheerful cartoon character looked back at him, still smiling its innocent smile, but Marcus felt like he was seeing it through different eyes. Officer Sarah Williams, who took his statement, noticed his shaking hands. "You did good in there, son. Staying calm, helping those folks. Have you ever thought about law enforcement or military service?" Marcus almost laughed at the suggestion. Him, the guy whose biggest accomplishment was making his high school principal laugh during detention? But something about the way she said it, something about the way the elderly customers had looked at him with trust instead of expecting entertainment, made him pause. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in bed staring at the ceiling, replaying the afternoon over and over. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the fear in people's faces and remembered how desperately he'd wanted to do something meaningful, something that mattered more than getting a laugh. He thought about his grandfather, who had served in Vietnam and rarely talked about it. The old man had a quiet strength that Marcus had never understood before. His grandfather never needed to be the funniest person in the room. People respected him for entirely different reasons. The next morning, Marcus drove to the military recruiting station downtown. He'd passed it hundreds of times, but never given it a second thought. The building looked more imposing now, with its flags and formal signs. He sat in his car for 20 minutes, gathering courage he didn't know he possessed. Sergeant First Class Roberts was the first recruiter Marcus met. A tall, stern-looking man with kind eyes. He listened patiently as Marcus stumbled through his reasons for being there. The sergeant didn't laugh when Marcus mentioned wanting to serve, didn't question his motives or his cartoon tattoo that peeked out from his sleeve. "Son, I've seen all types come through that door. Some know exactly what they want. Others are running from something. And some are running towards something they can't quite name yet. Which one are you?" Marcus considered the question seriously. "I think I'm running towards something, sir. I just don't know what it is yet." The aptitude tests and initial interviews revealed something surprising. Marcus scored exceptionally high in areas related to precision, focus, and hand-eye coordination. Skills he'd never known he possessed, buried under years of choosing laughter over challenge. "Have you ever considered specialized training?" Sergeant Roberts asked during their third meeting. "Your scores suggest you might excel in roles requiring extreme precision and mental discipline." Marcus didn't understand what that meant at first, but as the sergeant explained various military occupational specialties, one caught his attention in a way he couldn't explain. It was demanding, required months of intensive training, and was the furthest thing from his class clown persona that he could imagine. When he called his parents that evening to tell them about his decision to enlist, the silence on the other end lasted so long he thought the call had dropped. "Marcus, honey," his mother finally said, her voice careful and confused. "Are you sure about this? You've never shown any interest in the military. You hate confrontation. You cry during sad movies." His father's response was more direct. "Son, you do realize this isn't summer camp, right? This is serious business. People's lives depend on soldiers doing their jobs right." But Marcus had made up his mind. For the first time in his life, he was choosing something that scared him instead of something that came easy. The tattoo on his arm had started as a declaration of who he was, but maybe it was time to discover who he could become. The weeks leading up to his departure for basic training passed in a blur of paperwork, medical exams, and goodbyes. His friends threw him a going-away party that felt more like a wake. None of them could quite believe that Marcus, their Marcus, was actually going through with this. "I give him 2 weeks," his college roommate whispered to another friend, not knowing Marcus could hear. "First time a drill sergeant yells at him, he'll be making jokes and washing out." Marcus pretended not to hear, but the words stung because part of him wondered if they were right. What if this was just another phase, another way of avoiding real responsibility? What if he really was just the class clown, destined never to be taken seriously? On his last night at home, he sat on his childhood bed, looking around the room filled with comedy posters and gag gifts from friends. Tomorrow he would leave all of this behind for something completely unknown. His mother knocked on the door and entered with a cup of tea, her eyes red from crying. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly, sitting beside him on the bed. "I'm terrified, but I'm proud. I've watched you make people happy your whole life. Maybe now you'll learn to make yourself proud too." As Marcus fell asleep that night, his last thought was of the grocery store, of the moment when making people laugh hadn't been enough. Tomorrow would begin his journey toward discovering what would be enough, what would make him the person he was meant to become. The cartoon character on his arm smiled up at him in the darkness, but Marcus was no longer smiling back. He was focused on something beyond laughter, something that would require every ounce of strength and determination he'd never known he possessed.